My sister mocked my divorce publicly, so I printed her texts, sent them to her husband, and watched the fallout from a distance. A 32-year-old guy, and I've always been the black sheep in my family. Growing up, I quickly learned that nothing I did was ever quite enough, no matter how hard I tried. My sister, Amanda, was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. She had this effortless charm that made everyone gravitate toward her, and our parents were openly proud, often comparing me unfavorably without even trying. I'd spend years trying to prove myself, trying to meet their expectations, and somehow, it still felt like I was walking on a tightrope above a pit of constant judgment. When I got married, I thought it might change things, that building my own life would finally earn me some respect. I worked hard, made compromises, and tried to keep the peace whenever my family inserted themselves into our marriage. But even then, I could feel the underlying tension whenever Amanda was around. She had this knack for saying things that seemed casual but were loaded, subtle digs wrapped in humor. "Oh, you really like wearing that shirt again?" Or "Interesting choice for the wedding registry." It was infuriating, but I brushed it off, convincing myself I was overreacting. Divorce wasn't something I ever imagined for myself, but reality hit hard. My marriage fell apart quietly at first, and I tried to handle it with dignity. I kept the details to myself, confiding only in close friends, hoping to avoid further embarrassment. But family gossip is relentless, and Amanda seemed to thrive on it. She had this mischievous way of getting information from one cousin or another and twisting it into a public spectacle. And then it happened, the first real stinging comment. I logged into the family group chat one evening, half expecting to see mundane messages about birthdays or dinner plans. Instead, there it was. A text from Amanda, bold and smug, shared with all our cousins. Wow, I didn't think my name could even survive a divorce without embarrassing himself. Guess miracles do happen. I stared at my phone, my stomach dropping, cheeks burning. Everyone saw it, everyone. And just like that, the floodgates of humiliation began to open. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but all I could do was sit there, numb. Wondering how one person could make me feel so small in my own family, I opened my phone the next morning, half expecting Amanda to have deleted the message, or at least apologized. She hadn't. Instead, she had added more, this time peppering the family group chat with little quips. Does he even know how to pick up the pieces of his life? And maybe therapy is his new hobby now. My hands shook as I scrolled, each notification like a small punch to the gut. I could feel my face flush, my heart hammering in my chest. I wanted to disappear. I wanted to crawl under my bed and pretend the world hadn't seen this public spectacle of my failure. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that her words were empty, that anyone with sense would see through her charm and recognize the cruelty behind it. But even as I reasoned it out, I knew better. Some of my cousins replied with laughing emojis, others with subtle digs that mirrored Amanda's tone. Every message felt like a reminder that in this family, I was the joke. The one everyone laughed at behind my back and sometimes to my face. The embarrassments twisted into anger. A slow burn I couldn't quite shake. Later that day, my spouse tried to calm me down. "Don't let her get to you," they said gently, wrapping an arm around my shoulders. "She thrives on attention. You know that." I nodded, but it didn't help. Seeing Amanda's words in black and white, knowing how many people had read them and smirked, made me feel powerless. I wanted to scream, to tell everyone the truth. But the thought of escalating things, of being called petty or vindictive, kept me frozen. I noticed something else to Amanda's subtle smirks whenever I was in the room. The way she would casually bring up my divorce in passing conversations with our parents, it was like she was testing boundaries, seeing how far she could push me before I broke. Each time she laughed or rolled her eyes at a comment she knew would sting, my resentment deepened. It wasn't just gossip anymore. It was calculated, a performance designed to make me squirm while she basked in the attention. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, heart still racing. I kept replaying the family chat over and over, Amanda's smug little messages echoing in my mind. A thought struck me, dangerous and electrifying. What if this time I didn't just sit and take it? What if there was a way to turn the tables, to expose her for the person she really was? The idea was fleeting, almost frightening, but it planted a seed I couldn't ignore. I couldn't stop thinking about Amanda's messages. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them flashing across my screen, that smug little grin in my mind's eye, knowing she'd humiliated me in front of everyone. I realized that if I didn't do something, it wasn't just about the divorce. Anymore, it was about her control, about the power she had over my family's perception of me. The thought of letting her keep that upper hand made my stomach twist. I needed proof, something undeniable that could show exactly who she was when no one was watching or when they thought no one would ever see. Over the next few days, I became meticulous. Every comment she made in group chats, every whispered remark she left on voicemails with cousins, every sly text that disparaged me, documented it. Screenshots, printed copies, notes in a small hidden notebook. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. I couldn't. The very idea of being seen collecting evidence felt obsessive, maybe even paranoid. But the sense of empowerment it gave me was intoxicating. For the first time in years, I felt like I was taking control, like I had a plan that didn't involve swallowing my pride silently. Even as I collected the proof, I wrestled with guilt. Is this petty? I asked myself more times than I could count. Am I stooping to her level? My spouse reassured me that what I was doing was smart, that I wasn't being vindictive, I was protecting myself, documenting the truth, but inside, a part of me worried. What if this backfired? What if the family saw me as the manipulative one? Anxiety prickled at the edges of my focus, but I pushed it aside. Amanda, of course, had no clue. She continued her performance, laughing with cousins about my failed marriage, sending those little barbed texts that always made me flinch. Each time she did it, it fueled my determination. I began to notice patterns, the times she gossiped, the way she phrased her mockery, even the emojis she used to soften the cruelty while keeping the sting. It was almost like watching a predator in action, knowing that this time the prey was starting to fight back. And then one afternoon, a shocking slip-up happened. Amanda, in her usual smug tone, sent a text meant for one cousin into the group chat where everyone, including her husband, could see it. I stared at the screen, pulse racing. Her arrogance, her habit of underestimating everyone, had just given me the first real leverage I hadn't dared hope for. But the thought of what I might do next made my hands shake, and I knew that once I acted, nothing could go back to the way it was. Amanda had no idea I was watching, documenting, and quietly plotting. She continued her little performances, laughing at my misfortune during family dinners, casually dropping comments about my divorce that made my chest tighten, my face burn, and my stomach twist. Wow, I didn't think my name could handle a breakup without making a scene, she said one evening at my parents' house, smirking as everyone chuckled politely. My parents laughed along, shaking their heads, while I clenched my fists under the table, my jaw aching from holding back the words I wanted to spit at her. The sense of helplessness was suffocating, but underneath it all, a strange focus began to form. I wouldn't let this slide anymore. I noticed how she did it almost methodically. She knew exactly how to phrase things to make her mockery sting without appearing overtly cruel. The laughs, the emojis, the harmless jokes, all carefully calibrated to keep her image pristine while letting me squirm. Each remark felt like a scalpel against my pride, but with every jab, my determination grew sharper. I began keeping meticulous notes of patterns, times, and contexts, each one a piece of the puzzle that could someday expose her. One evening, she made a comment that went further than usual. Honestly, I can't imagine being that sad and bitter about a divorce. He really should have known better than to marry someone like him, she texted in the family chat. I felt the heat rise in my face, my throat tightening. The cousins responded with subtle emojis, smirks, and a few lighthearted remarks, completely oblivious or perhaps willing participants in her little performance. I wanted to respond, to defend myself, but a small, insistent voice in my head said, "Not yet. Watch, wait, gather everything." The house smelled faintly of my mother's lavender air freshener, a small comfort in the oppressive tension Amanda always seemed to bring with her. I paced my apartment later that night, my fingers tapping nervously against my phone, rereading her words, analyzing her tone, imagining the way she laughed with Mark, her husband, unaware of the storm brewing quietly beneath the surface. And that's when it hit me, the perfect idea. If I could somehow expose her for the manipulative, gossipy person she truly was, and make it undeniable to the one person who mattered most to her, her husband, then maybe, just maybe, I could finally reclaim some of the power she'd stolen from me all these years. But it was risky. One wrong move, and it could backfire spectacularly. My heart pounded as I realized this wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about survival. And the first step would require patience, precision, and nerves of steel. The next few days were a blur of observation and quiet planning. Amanda, blissfully unaware, continued her usual routines, sending sly, mocking texts about me, laughing with cousins, posting, little digs in the group chat that left me feeling exposed and powerless. One evening, she even called my mother to recount how pathetic I looked at dinner last week, embellishing details in a way that made my parents chuckle, oblivious to how cruel it really was. The betrayal wasn't just in her words, it was in the casual way she manipulated everyone around her, bending reality to make herself the star of the story, while I remained the punchline. I wanted to explode, to confront her and demand she stop. But I knew that reaction would give her exactly what she wanted. Instead, I observed the patterns in her behavior, the moments when she let her guard slip. Every joke, every smirk, every carefully worded comment became a piece of evidence in my mind. I started noticing things I hadn't before, how she phrased insults with just kidding tacked on the end, how she timed her messages for maximum effect, even how she used emojis to soften the sting while keeping it alive. Each detail made me angrier, but also more focused. I began imagining what it would feel like to finally turn the tables, to make her realize the power she had wielded over me could be taken away in an instant. One afternoon, Amanda sent a particularly cruel text that revealed something I hadn't known. An admission that she had been deliberately sharing private details with certain cousins to embarrass me. I froze as I read it, my chest tightening, stomach churning. Part of me wanted to confront her immediately, to scream at her, to make her feel even a fraction of the humiliation I had endured. But a calmer, sharper part of me recognized the opportunity. This was exactly the kind of proof I needed if I ever decided to act. Later that evening, I sat on my couch staring at the ceiling, notebook in hand, phone nearby, heart hammering. The room smelled faintly of the takeout I hadn't touched, the city lights flickering through the blinds. My mind raced with possibilities and consequences. I could act now, impulsively, and risk everything, or I could wait, gather more evidence, and ensure that when the moment came, it would be undeniable. I clenched my fists, feeling a strange mix of fear and exhilaration. I knew one thing for certain: Amanda had underestimated me, and that mistake could be her undoing. But the question lingering in my mind as I drifted to sleep was terrifying. How far was I willing to go to make her pay? By the time I reached part 6 in my head, the plan had sharpened into something almost surgical. I kept replaying Amanda's texts like evidence in a case file each, one more damning than the last stand. The more I looked, the clearer the target became. Mark. He was the one person whose opinion actually mattered to Amanda, the one whose trust would crack her carefully constructed image. If he saw the catalog of her little cruelties laid out in print, there'd be no laughter, no just kidding to hide behind. The idea felt both vindicating and terrifying. I remember the evening I realized it could work. I was at my kitchen table, the lamp throwing a pool of yellow over my notes. The apartment smelled like burnt coffee because I'd forgotten to make a fresh pot. The city noise was distant, muffled by the window. I printed the texts, each message cleanly time-stamped, each screenshot cropped so no context could be twisted. As the pages fed through the printer, it sounded absurdly final paper after paper. Like steps in a dance, I couldn't stop. "Are you sure about this?" my spouse asked, voice low. This could destroy more than her reputation. "I know," I said, "but watching her humiliate me every week, that's destroying me." "You could talk to Mark directly," they suggested. "And say what?" "Hey, your wife's a gossip and a liar." I snapped, then softened. "No, if he sees it without feeling attacked, he might actually listen." That's when the midpoint hit me like a punch. Mark, completely oblivious, had been included in the family chat thread more than once. He was on that platform. He read messages, and he trusted Amanda implicitly. I realized the leverage wasn't theoretical. It was practical. The guilt crept in if I broke their marriage. Was I any better than she was? The line between justice and cruelty blurred until it was almost invisible. I folded the pages into a neat stack, my hands trembling. I could feel my pulse in my throat, the paper's edges pressing into my palm. I told myself I would do it. Carefully, an anonymous note, or left at his doorstep as a concern. The car keys were on the table. I stood up, the lamp buzzing overhead, and as I walked to the door, I thought, for the first time in months, about what would happen if he read them and believed every word. The night I decided to act, my hands were shaking more than I expected. I carried the neatly stacked texts in a manila envelope, feeling the weight of every word Amanda had ever typed. Each step toward the mailbox felt like walking a tightrope above a pit I couldn't see. My apartment smelled faintly of the leftover takeout I hadn't touched, the cold city air seeping in through a crack in the window. I thought about Amanda, laughing, smug, unaware that her little empire of gossip and cruelty could crumble so quickly. I left the envelope in Mark's mailbox just before midnight, making sure no one saw me. My mind raced with scenarios. He could dismiss it, confront her, or worse, think I was meddling and blame me entirely. But I had to believe he'd see the truth. I imagined him reading her texts, the realization washing over him, the shock on his face as the reality of her behavior hit. The thought made my pulse pound with equal parts fear and anticipation. Meanwhile, Amanda kept up her usual act. That weekend at a family gathering, she bragged about some cousin gossip, laughing as everyone leaned in to hear the story. I sat quietly, pretending to be absorbed in my drink, listening to her repeat every condescending word she had ever aimed at me. The knowledge that the envelope was already in Mark's hands was a secret thrill, a private victory that no one else could see. "Do you even realize what you're missing?" she said, twirling her hair, a sly smile curling her lips. "I'm sure someone has informed you by now," I thought, a small smirk tugging at my face. But I stayed silent, letting her talk, letting her think she still had the upper hand by the time I returned to my apartment. Adrenaline had left me jittery, staring at the ceiling as the city lights flickered against the blinds. I tried to imagine Mark reading the envelope, piece by piece, each text a dagger piercing Amanda's carefully crafted image. My stomach churned with nerves, and I realized there was no turning back now. Once the envelope was in his hands, the dominoes would start falling, and I would be forced to watch the fallout from a distance. Powerless to stop it, but powerless to resist seeing it unravel. I checked my phone obsessively, half expecting a flurry of messages from Amanda or my family. Nothing yet. The silence was deafening, almost worse than if she had confronted me immediately. My stomach churned with anticipation, imagining Mark sitting in his living room, carefully unfolding the envelope, scanning each text, each cruel, smug remark. I tried to picture his expression: shock, confusion, anger. On the thought made my pulse race uncontrollably. By the afternoon, the first ripple appeared. Amanda was unusually quiet in the group chat. No jokes, no smug emojis, no barbed comments. It was subtle, but anyone who knew her would notice immediately. I felt a thrill of satisfaction, tempered by nerves. I had no idea what Mark had thought, or how he would confront her, but for the first time in months, I sensed the balance had shifted, even, if just slightly. That evening, I received a text from a cousin I barely spoke to. "Mark came by today. He seemed different, just saying." My heart leaped, then sank with anxiety. What did different mean? Was it disbelief, anger, confrontation? Every nerve in my body was on edge. I could practically hear Amanda's smug laughter in my head, now replaced with a thin veil of panic I'd never heard from her before. Later, I imagined the conversation that must have happened behind closed doors. "Amanda, what is this?" I pictured Mark's calm voice, tinged with disbelief, as he held the printed texts in his hands. I imagined her stammering, fumbling for excuses, trying to gaslight him, her confidence cracking like fragile glass. I felt a thrill, the kind that comes from seeing someone who has tormented you finally caught off guard, powerless. But even as I allowed myself this small satisfaction, fear crept in. I had no idea how far the fallout would go. Would family members take sides? Would Amanda's arrogance push her to accuse me of meddling? I sat by my window that night, the city lights flickering in the darkness, a low hum of tension vibrating through me. I realized this was just the beginning, and the hardest part was still to come. The next few days felt like walking through a storm. Amanda's behavior had changed subtly, but unmistakably her usual smug confidence was cracked, her jokes more forced, her glances darting toward Mark as if expecting judgment at any moment. Family gatherings became unbearably tense. I watched from the sidelines as whispers circulated, cousins exchanging quick, furtive glances. And even my parents seemed unsettled, unsure how to react. The power she once wielded so effortlessly was slipping, and I could feel it like electricity in the air. Then came the confrontation I had been dreading and anticipating all at once. Amanda cornered me in the kitchen while our parents were distracted. Her voice was low, sharp, and dripping with indignation. "Did you do something? Did you send him those texts?" she demanded, eyes narrowing. I could see the panic behind her bravado, the tiny cracks in the armor she always wore. My stomach churned, part of me terrified of escalation, part of me thrilled that she finally realized I wasn't as helpless as she thought. "Don't know what you're talking about," I said calmly, letting her stew in the uncertainty. Her face flushed, and she opened her mouth as if to argue, then hesitated. I could practically hear the gears turning, the frantic calculations in her head. That night, lying in bed, I felt the weight of everything, years of ridicule, years of feeling invisible. But it wasn't just Amanda I worried about. The fallout had begun to touch everyone around us. Cousins were whispering, parents were watching, and I could feel the tension straining even those who had always seemed neutral. It was overwhelming, like standing at the edge of a cliff with no idea how far the fall might be. I stared at the ceiling, the city lights casting long shadows through my blinds, heart hammering. I realized that this was my rock-bottom moment. The family I thought I knew, the safe spaces I once had, were crumbling around me. I had set these events in motion, and now I was powerless to stop the chaos that followed. All I could do was wait and hope that when the storm fully hit, it would land exactly where it needed to, squarely on Amanda. The fallout hit harder than I expected. Word had spread through the family like wildfire, and even those who had always avoided conflict were now subtly taking sides. Mark confronted Amanda fully, and I imagined the scene in vivid detail, him holding the stack of printed texts, voice calm but sharp, his eyes searching hers for answers she couldn't give. She tried to deflect, to joke, to gaslight, but every excuse fell flat. The evidence was undeniable, and for the first time, she couldn't charm her way out. I stayed in the background, intentionally distant, watching the consequences unfold. The texts I had compiled her smug insults, the casual humiliation she'd doled out for years, were now in the hands of the one person whose opinion actually mattered to her. I could almost hear the disbelief and hurt in Mark's voice as he read each page, each message a tiny dagger exposing Amanda's true self. Family members began to murmur, their shock mingling with a grim satisfaction that justice, in a small but satisfying way, had been served. Amanda's bravado crumbled over the next few days. At family dinners, she laughed less, spoke cautiously, eyes darting nervously whenever someone mentioned me or my divorce. The smug, untouchable figure I had grown up watching was now reduced to a shell of carefully measured words and forced smiles. I could sense her internal panic, the realization that her reputation, the thing she valued above all else, was slipping beyond her control. And yet, even with the satisfaction of seeing her falter, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. The family dynamics had shifted irrevocably. Conversations were tense, side glances frequent, and the usual comfort of gatherings felt hollow. But within that discomfort, I felt a quiet vindication, a sense that, for the first time, I was no longer powerless in my own family, no longer the scapegoat silently enduring her games. That night, lying in bed, I allowed myself a small, private smile. The storm I had feared, the confrontation I had dreaded, had arrived, and it had landed exactly where it needed to. But even as I exhaled, a tiny nagging thought remained at the back of my mind. What would Amanda do next? The tension wasn't over yet, and I knew the next move could either solidify my victory or unravel everything I had worked toward. Amanda's collapse was gradual but unmistakable. Mark confronted her repeatedly over the next week, each time more sternly, laying out the texts, pointing out every cruel, calculated remark she'd made about me. She tried to joke, to charm, to rewrite history, but every word fell flat. The facade she had so carefully built for years was cracking, and I could almost hear the sound of it splintering. Her panic was palpable, the kind that makes someone frantic yet impotent, and for the first time, I felt a surge of quiet, intense satisfaction. Family members began to take notice. Cousins, who had once laughed at my misfortune, now exchanged wary glances with Amanda, some even subtly questioning her actions. Even my parents, who had previously laughed at her jokes at my expense, started to notice the cracks in her armor. I stayed in the background, letting the chaos unfold without comment. The tension like a low hum vibrating through the room. I watched Amanda struggle to maintain control, her voice tight, her smiles forced. The confident veneer she had carried for so long stripped away under the weight of the truth for me. The payoff was more than just seeing Amanda falter, it was the emotional catharsis I had longed for. Years of humiliation, subtle digs, and public mockery had built up inside me, a pressure that now released in a quiet, satisfying way. I felt vindicated, empowered, and oddly serene. I didn't have to shout, confront, or fight. I simply let the evidence speak for itself, and the consequences unfolded naturally, painfully, undeniably. Yet even with the satisfaction, there was a lingering awareness that things would never be the same. Family dynamics had shifted, alliances were questioned, and old grievances resurfaced. But I felt a deep sense of closure, a quiet confidence that I had reclaimed my agency in a family that had long rendered me powerless. As I lay in bed that night, city lights casting long shadows through the blinds, I realized something profound. I hadn't just exposed Amanda's cruelty, had reclaimed myself. I could finally breathe, knowing that the power she had wielded over me for so long was gone. But in the back of my mind, a whisper lingered. Amanda wasn't done yet. The story wasn't completely over. By the time the dust settled, I could finally see things clearly. Amanda's arrogance had been stripped away. Mark knew the full extent of her manipulations. And the cousins, who had once laughed at me, now looked at me differently, not with mockery, but with a quiet acknowledgement of what I'd endured. I felt an unfamiliar sense of calm, like a storm had passed and left the air cleaner lighter, for the first time in years. I could breathe in my own home without the gnawing weight of humiliation. The family gatherings were still tense, but in a different way. Conversations were careful, measured. No one made offhand jokes at my expense anymore. Amanda's smirk was gone, replaced with a tense, watchful silence. She tried to reclaim her composure, but it was too late. The carefully curated image she had built for years had cracked, and everyone could see the pieces. I didn't need to gloat. The truth had done the work for me. I reflected on what I had learned from the entire ordeal. I realized that reclaiming my power didn't come from lashing out, yelling, or seeking public revenge. It came from patience, observation, and calculated action. I had stayed silent, documented the truth, and let reality speak for itself. The satisfaction wasn't in humiliating Amanda. It was in finally freeing myself from the years of her manipulation and the shadow she had cast over my life. There were moments when I thought about the possibility of forgiveness, not for Amanda, but for myself, for allowing myself to feel anger, pain, and resentment for so long. I allowed that reflection to wash over me, a gentle reminder that healing was possible even after betrayal. I felt empowered, stronger than I had in years, and finally in control of my own narrative. As I looked out at the city lights through my window, I understood something profoundly simple yet powerful. The people who try to belittle you only have the power you give them. I had taken that power back quietly, deliberately, and without compromise. And as for Amanda, she would have to live with the consequences of her actions, while I moved forward, unshaken, finally free.